So welcome to Module 9, which picks up really where we left off in that we're still going to be talking about interviews. In the previous module, we talked about the basics, the fact that an interview is made up of screens, and screens can be further broken into chapters, which we call stages, so screens and stages. We also discussed the need for the basic idea of getting input from the users, from our consumers, and we talked about making sure that at the end of the interview we gave an explanation of what actually they were filling in all that data for. You know, if you go online and you get asked questions like, how old are you, what is your vision, and have you scored 20, 50, 100% in an exam, you'd be thinking, well, what is this for? Is this until we tell you, okay, this is because our goal was to find out whether you were authorized to fly a plane or not. So focusing on the goal gave us the need to provide explanations. And obviously it also meant that when we adjusted the goal of the interview, we, for the first time, touched on the concept of relevancy. Screens that were no longer relevant, well, Intelligent Advisor won't show them. At this stage, I appreciate that that's a lot to take in so far. A lot of this will become clear as we work through the other chapters. All I want you to focus on at this stage is that building an interview is, as you saw, a fairly simple double-click here, double-click there to get a basic interview up and running that you could test in your debugger. In this chapter, we're going to look a little bit more at how we can make things a little bit better for our audience. We'll see some concepts demonstrated very simply here, but when we take them to the next level, can become extremely powerful. So this is all about improving the interview. We're going to look at just 4 different ways to improve an interview, and trust me, there are many more, and we'll be talking about them in later chapters, but this is just to get us started. We'll talk about proposing a list to the users. We'll add images to our screens. We'll develop rules that can control the visibility of items, and we'll also look at the different alternative control types for certain kinds of attribute. Lists. I'm sure we've all been on the internet and we've come to a piece of information that is required of us, and it says what county or what state or what region do you live in? And you click, and there's a drop-down list, and you pick from a list. It's an expectation on the part of every audience or every consumer is that you don't have to type in certain kinds of data because they repeat in every interview you've ever done. In Intelligent Advisor, there are 2 ways to handle this, and which method you choose will depend upon what you want to do with the list. For now, I'm going to content myself simply with describing the 2 different choices and the for and the against, and then in the demo we'll look at both of them. If you have a list of choices that you're only going to use once, in one screen, in one interview, well then, you can use a feature known as a screen value list and simply add the values to the item on the screen. So I want you to focus on these 2 little things here. First of all, we're talking about this attribute. What is the candidate's vision score? You may remember in my demo I typed in 21 or 22. So I've changed it and I've said I want to use a drop-down. So that's the first step, is selecting the item that you want and then choosing a different type. The default type is single line text box. So I've switched it to drop-down. As soon as I do that, I'll be required to enter values, because if you have a drop-down, we need to know where the values come from. And I've entered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different values. You'll notice that you have values and display. Without going into too much detail at this stage, maybe you have values such as 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and you display poor, medium, okay, quite good, and very good, but the underlying values are still what you're interested in. So it's the difference between a value and a display value. For those of you who come from CX or anything like that, that should sound very familiar. So this is a great option if it's a one-shot, never need it again. Sometimes though, you realize that you're building a list and inside the same interview, maybe it appears on 3 different screens. Probably you don't want to do it 3 times. Better still, you maybe realize that somebody else who's working on another project maybe could want to use your list as well. So we need something that's a bit more modular, that is not attached to a specific screen, and that we can easily get out of policy modeling. And this option requires us to go through the project. So it's something that's associated with the project rather than associated with the screen. We're going to do it in 2 parts, and I'll show you both in the demo, but I want you to notice this. First of all, the prerequisite is you set up the list. So this is an example here. I've decided to set up a list of choices, and you'll see that I have values and display values. And I don't know if you can see that, but there's also a third option which is going to come in very handy one day. You can associate an image with each of the values. So instead, for example, if this is, I'm building an interview that is a drive-in burger bar, and I ask you, what size of meal do you want? Do you want large or extra large? Instead of asking you large or extra large, I could show a picture of a large burger or a very large burger, replacing the values with an image. To go even one step further, you could have an inactive burger and an active burger. So the one that you click on is highlighted. Features that we'd associate with almost any modern interview experience, any modern HTML experience, and you can do it right here with no code. This part is the most important. I've gone back to the attribute, the candidate's vision score, and currently it was listed as a number. Now, however, I've been able to select my value list. So I'm saying, look, this is a number, but it's not just any number, it's a number from the list that I'm going to give you. So technically speaking, the binding is we've bound the list to an attribute. And for those of you who are interested, the same list could apply to multiple attributes, and we could also export that if we wanted, as I'll show you in the demo. So lists, we have 2 ways of dealing with the need to improve user experience. What are the other simple ways we can improve user experience? Well, you may remember a minute ago I talked about the idea of saying whether you're male or female and then having to answer a question about whether you're expecting a baby. For me, that's a classic example of perhaps a control on a screen in your stage that isn't always visible. The question, are you expecting a baby, maybe is only visible if you choose female. That concept of show if, hide if, I'm sure you can see where that's going. If I have a Boolean attribute like the person is female or the person is male, then I could say, well, show if, hide if. But show if and hide if, we can go even further. We could say, for example, that control is required if, or optional if, or enabled if, or unavailable if. Another way to improve the user experience, and this is a very basic way but can be incredibly useful, is to add images. Images, first of all, could be a static image. Here you can see I've got a picture of a green tick. But like the elements we spoke about in the previous slide, this green tick could be show if, hide if. So we could hide the green tick if you're not holding a valid pilot's license. We could show a red cross if you're answering no to this question. So this concept of showing and hiding controls is very simple and very, very useful. You probably noticed that when I built the first screens in the previous chapter, it was very linear. It was very vertical. It was just kind of one thing after another. Sooner or later, you're going to want to build a side-by-side layout. So in the demo that's coming up shortly, we'll talk about another way to improve the user experience by adding a container. So we're going to talk about lists, we're going to talk about show if, hide if, and all those variants on controlling visibility. We're going to talk about adding images, and we're going to talk about containers. Those 4 items should enable us to, at least without too much effort, greatly improve the user experience. So ready for our demo. So you'll remember from the previous example that we have basic health information, basic competency information, and basic pilot information. So these are the finished screens from the previous chapter. The first thing we're going to talk about is, how do I implement a list? Let's say that this particular attribute here, the vision score, we only want users to round up their numbers, or we want them to answer from a list. As I mentioned, there were two different ways of doing it. Let's experience the first one. Make sure that I've selected the control, and then select from the interview toolbar the kind of control I would like to have. I'd like to have a drop-down. As soon as I do that, a warning appears and says, well, look, if you want to drop down, you got to tell me what the values are. I can click values, and I can begin my work of entering the different values. So I'm just going to do a couple. I don't even know if there is a 25, so you'll forgive me. And when I click here, the warning, the error message has gone away. So now, when I go to the debugger, or when my audience finally gets hold of this interview, I can select from a drop-down. In that little demo, we reached out onto the toolbar and found a really interesting concept, is that you can choose different control types. Not every control type matches every circumstance. But maybe you say to me, well, Richard, actually the drop-down, yeah, not so much. I would like it to be text buttons. Fine. So instead of having a drop-down, we can now see a set of buttons. So each of these is clickable. Or you could say, Richard, I actually like to have a slider. That would be much nicer. Again, I really want to reinforce this. You're probably thinking, well, yeah, of course. But this will drastically reduce the amount of time it takes you to build a simple and yet successful interview. So let's go back and say we want to drop down. We haven't viewed all of the types of control, and we'll see a few more in this demo, and we'll see a few more later on, don't worry. I'm going to now turn my attention to the competencies page. You may remember we have the date and the two Booleans. The calendar is the default, but if you want to, you could have a 3-stage date, or you could simply have 3 text boxes. I know I'm a great fan of the calendar. And for the Boolean, I could choose, let's say, for example, a checkbox or a switch, amongst other things. Those of you who use tablets will realize that the switch was designed to look the same whether you're on a tablet or on a desktop, that sort of thing. So I'm going to go back and switch that back to a radio button. Again, we'll see all of these control types in due course. And I'm going to return to the vision score. I'd like you to play along with me for a moment and imagine that upon reflection, I realize that this drop-down list, I'm going to use it several times. I don't know, maybe there's another attribute that says, what is the average age of the population of pilots, and I'll have 10, 15, 20, 25, I'll have the same drop down. I want to reuse this list. At the moment, this list is totally bound to this control. If I go back to the values, I want you to notice that there's a very neat feature which says, okay, if you've changed your mind, if you realize now that you want to use this again, you can convert it. Or you can go to the project tab, as I mentioned earlier, go to value lists and create it manually. So I'm going to create it manually in order to show you what happens in the background if you were to click that button that says convert. So I'm going to say vision levels. That's the name I'm going to give to it. This list is a list of numbers. So just like attributes, lists can be lists of different things. And I'm going to say 10, I can't remember what it was now, 15, 20, 25. You'll notice also that in this list, there's a value called uncertain. We'll talk about this in much more detail in the next section of our class. The concept of being uncertain allows for situations where you need to say, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe. This is valid both for your audience, who wants to say, I'm not sure, but Intelligent Advisor in certain circumstances, if it doesn't have enough information to be able to reach a goal, may also tell you that it's not sure. So I'm going to click OK. And I'm now going to go to the Data tab, and I'm going to select the candidate's vision score, the attribute that I want to work with. I can now associate it with my vision level list. What does that mean? That means that now it's bound to the attribute. If the value list needs to be used by a colleague, I have an easy way to export it. And let's imagine that I have a new attribute called the number of years flying in USA. I could say, well, this also uses the same list. So I'm recycling the list and not having to go through the trouble of entering too many lists another time. So if I go back and I add an input and add the number of years flying in the USA, you'll see straight away it has the drop down, and if I was to run this, it would have the values because it's inherited them from the list. There was no need to go through the mechanics of choosing the values and so on. So creating lists is a very simple and easy way to make your experience better. But you know what? Layouts like this are probably not going to be much fun to deal with if you're the audience, because the more attributes you have, the more space you're going to take up. This is all very linear and vertical. What happens if I want to put two items side by side? To do that, I will need to use something called a container. A container is just as its name suggests. It's a box. It's something that can contain other controls. So I'm going to add a container, and I'm going to drag and drop two items into the container. And I'll move that up to the top above the container. So now you'll notice that the elements in the container are appearing side by side. And I actually now have control over how much space is given up to each of these controls when they're inside a container. So if you're thinking, great, I can do multi-column layouts, you're absolutely right. This would be the starting point for doing multiple columns. Of course, the container here, I can rename it and say this is competency container, because if you have hundreds of them or dozens of them, it's kind of hard if you see just container, container, container. And I'm going to go one step further and adjust these to make them checkboxes. And checkbox. Another thing which you might be complaining about already in your head, you're thinking, this is too long. What is the candidate's license expiry date? Simply double-clicking means I can replace the system-generated text with my own label. In certain circumstances, you don't want to be too long-winded, you want to be short and to the point. This does not affect the attribute in any way. The attribute remains with the original text. This is just how it's displayed in the interview. Now let's go back to the pilot information. And here we have what is the candidate's date of birth. Let's imagine that we want to display some piece of information to show that the candidate's date of birth meets our criteria. You may remember that we have a rule in there that says you've got to be aged 18 or over. I'm going to do this in two steps. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say I need an image. So I'm going to go and get an image. I'm going to display an image, and bear with me for a moment, but I think I have an image there. There we go. So you're thinking, okay, he's displaying an image, great. I have a warning that says, be careful if you're designing this interview to be fully accessible to users of assistive technology like screen readers, because if you create an image, you must also give it what is known as alternative text. So just click on the image and give it alternative text. And there we go. It's a warning for people who, especially if you're designing for a government organization, you need to be respecting a certain level of adherence to these guidelines. So this image is now going to display. But in fact, I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to say, show this image if, let's say, the candidate satisfies the health criteria. So this image, will only display when that condition is true. When you start combining these, it can get very interesting because you can have a dynamic display of information or a dynamic display of pictures based on what the user is doing. Let's go to the competencies, and here we have my new layout with my two checkboxes, and I'll do the same thing here as well. I'll add an image. I'll use the same image, sake of argument. I will add my alternative text, and I will say show if the candidate has a valid pilot's license, is true, false, certain, and so on. I'm going to say it's true. So now, when I debug my interview, to save time, I'm going to go straight to the competency page, because I only want to show you the competency page. Does the candidate have a valid pilot's license? When I click the box, the arrow appears. When I uncheck it, the arrow disappears. Simple, but the beginning of a dynamic user interface to enable us to respond to what the user is doing. The final thing I want to show you in this demo relates to the ability to work with different controls and containers. Just so that you are aware, we can have multiple containers inside each other. And this will allow us to drag and drop and create very sophisticated layouts, because when you're working in a small form factor screen, you really have to work hard to make sure that you're using all of the screen real estate. So don't think that you can only have one container, you can have as many containers as you want. And that wraps it up for that demo about enhancing our interviews.